Adopt my children and be my husband, human. The alien widow's last hope. The wind howled through the cracked streets of the desert market, kicking up clouds of red dust that stung the eyes and clung to everything. Jace trudged forward, his boots heavy from days of walking, his coat tattered from years of wear. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by too many suns and too few smiles. Once, he'd been a pilot, soaring between stars, but that life was gone now, lost in a crash that wasn't his fault but cost him everything. Here, on this forgotten planet, he was just another wanderer, scraping by with odd jobs and the last of his credits. The market buzzed around him, a chaotic mess of noise and smells. Vendors shouted over each other, selling roasted meat on sticks, strange fruits with glowing skins, and bits of salvaged tech from ships long dead. Aliens of every shape moved through the crowd, some with scales, others with feathers, all with eyes that darted suspiciously. Jace kept his head down, his hand resting near the small knife at his belt. He wasn't looking for trouble, just a meal and a place to rest. Then he saw her. She stood near a fruit stall, her thin frame wrapped in a faded cloak. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft green that marked her as different even among the aliens here. Two small children clung to her sides, their wide eyes sunken with hunger, their matching green skin dull from days without enough food. The woman's voice was low, pleading, as she held out a trembling hand to the vendor. "Please, just a little. My kids haven't eaten since yesterday." The vendor, a hulking figure with 4 arms and a sneer, waved her off. "No credits, no food. Get lost, half-breed." Jace stopped walking. The crowd muttered, some laughing, others spitting words like outcast and filth. He saw the way the woman's shoulders slumped, the way her kids pressed closer, scared and weak. Something twisted in his chest. Anger, maybe, or just the memory of being hungry and alone himself. He stepped forward before he could think it through, his voice cutting through the noise. "Give her the fruit." The vendor turned, glaring. "Who are you, human? Mind your own business." Jace didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of credits, his last ones, and dropped them on the stall. "Now it's my business. Give it to her." The vendor grumbled but shoved a small bag of fruit into the woman's hands. She took it, her fingers shaking, and looked up at Jace. Her eyes were deep and tired, but there was a spark in them, something fierce. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm Lyra. These are my children, Milo and Kina." The boy, Milo, peeked out from behind her, his tiny hand clutching her cloak. "Kina." The girl stared at Jace like she wasn't sure if he was friend or foe. He nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm Jace. Don't mention it." But Lyra didn't move away. She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "You don't understand. No one helps us. My people cast us out because my kids, they're not pure enough for them. We've got nowhere to go." Jace shifted, uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero, just a guy who didn't like seeing kids starve. "You've got food now. You'll be fine," he said, turning to leave. "Wait." Her voice stopped him cold. He turned back, and she took a deep breath, like she was gathering every bit of courage she had left. "I need more than food. My children need a home, someone to protect them. Marry me, human. Adopt them. Be their father." The words hit him like a punch. The crowd went silent, eyes wide, waiting for him to laugh or walk away. Milo tugged at Lyra's cloak, whispering, "Mama, what are you doing?" Kina just stared, her small fists clenched. Jace opened his mouth, then closed it. Marry her. Adopt her kids. He wasn't built for that. He was a loner, a drifter. But he looked at Milo, so small and frail, and Kina, trying so hard to be brave. He thought of his old crew, the ones he'd failed to save, and the guilt that still woke him up at night. Maybe this was a chance to do something right for once. "You don't even know me," he said finally. "I know you're strong," Lyra replied. I know you didn't have to help, but you did. That's enough." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands tightened around the bag of fruit. Jace rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. This was crazy. But those kids, they needed someone. And maybe, deep down, he needed something too. "Fine," he said at last, the word heavy but sure. "Let's get out of here." Lyra's eyes widened, like she hadn't expected him to agree. The crowd erupted in whispers, a human with an alien. Insane. But Jace ignored them. He jerked his head toward the edge of the market. "Come on. I've got a place. It's not much, but it's safe." Lyra nodded, pulling Milo and Kina close. They followed him, stepping out of the market's chaos into the dusty unknown. Jace didn't know what he'd just signed up for, but as the wind whipped around them, he felt a strange certainty. Whatever came next, he wasn't walking away. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the market, a sea of red sand and broken rocks, lit by the faint glow of 2 moons. Jace led Lyra, Milo, and Kina through the dunes, his boots kicking up dust with every step. The wind howled louder now, tugging at his coat and stinging his face. He glanced back to check on them. Lyra walked with her head high despite her tired steps. Milo clung to her hand, and Kina trailed a little behind, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. They didn't complain, not even the kids, and that made Jace respect them more than he expected. After what felt like hours, they reached his shelter. It sat on the edge of the planet's ruined outskirts, a squat box of metal patched together from old ship parts. Rust streaked its sides, and a single flickering light buzzed above the door. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy, built to survive the sandstorms that tore through this place too often. Jace punched a code into a keypad, and the door hissed open. "Inside," he said, stepping aside to let them pass. Lyra hesitated, peering into the dim space. It was small, just one room with a cot in the corner, a table littered with tools, and a humming heatbox in the center. A few crates of supplies lined the walls, and a scratched window showed the storm brewing outside. Milo darted in first, his curiosity winning over his hunger. "Whoa, is this all yours?" he asked, his voice small but bright. Jace shrugged. "Yeah, not much, but it keeps me alive." Kina stepped in slower, her arms crossed like she was judging the place. "It's better than the streets," she said finally, and Jace caught the faintest hint of approval in her tone. Lyra followed, setting the bag of fruit on the table. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time, like she still couldn't believe they were here. Jace waved it off, shutting the door as the wind outside turned into a roar. Sand battered the walls, but the shelter held strong. They sat in silence for a while, the kids munching on the fruit Jace had bought. Milo's eyes lit up with every bite, and even Kina softened a little, licking juice off her fingers. Lyra watched them, her hands folded tight in her lap. Jace leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying her. She'd thrown her whole life at him back there. Marry me, adopt my kids, and he still didn't know why she trusted a stranger like him. "You gonna tell me your story?" he asked at last, keeping his voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. Lyra's eyes flicked to him, then away. She took a slow breath, like the words hurt to pull out. "I wasn't always like this. I had a home once, a mate, my people bond for life. But he turned on us, said our children were wrong, impure, because they don't look exactly like him or his kind. The elders agreed. They exiled me, said I'd shamed them. We've been running ever since." Her voice stayed steady, but her fingers dug into her cloak. Jace nodded, letting her words sink in. He'd seen cruelty before. Humans and aliens alike could be ruthless. But this felt personal, raw. "And their father?" he asked, glancing at Milo and Kina. Lyra's jaw tightened. "He's alive. Out there somewhere. He didn't want them then, but I don't trust he'll stay away." The heatbox hummed louder as the storm raged outside, sand scraping the window like claws. Jace shifted, his own past creeping up on him. "I get it," he said after a pause. "I used to fly ships. Cargo runs, mostly. Good life, till I crashed one. Wasn't my fault. But they blamed me anyway. Lost my crew, my job, everything. Been drifting since." He didn't look at her, just stared at the floor. It was the most he'd told anyone in years. Milo finished his fruit and climbed onto the cot, bouncing a little. "This is soft. Mr. Jace, are you staying with us now?" His wide eyes locked onto Jace, full of hope. Jace froze, the question hitting harder than he expected. "I'm here now, kid," he said, dodging the bigger answer. Milo grinned, but Kina watched him silently, like she wasn't sure he meant it. The storm grew worse, rattling the shelter's walls. A loose panel banged somewhere, and Jace grabbed a tool from the table. "Stay put," he told them, heading to a corner where wind leaked in. Lyra stood too, picking up a scrap of metal. "I can help," she said. Together, they patched the gap, her hand steady despite her exhaustion. Jace showed her how to seal it tight, and she caught on fast. When they finished, she gave him a small, tired smile. "We're not useless," she said. "I never thought you were," Jace replied, and he meant it. The storm screamed outside, but inside, the shelter felt warmer, not just from the heat box, but from something else. Milo yawned, curling up on the cot, and Kina sat beside him, still watching Jace. Lyra settled near them, her eyes on the door like she expected trouble any second. Jace stayed by the wall, listening to the wind. He'd said yes to this strange deal, but now what? The kids needed him, Lyra needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. The days after the storm passed quietly in Jace's shelter, a fragile calm settling over the small group. The red desert outside stretched still and silent under the twin moons, the sand smoothed flat by the wind. Inside, the heat box hummed softly, casting a warm glow over the patched-up room. Milo and Kina had taken to exploring every corner, their voices filling the space with small bursts of chatter. Lyra stayed close to them, her hands busy mending a tear in Milo's cloak, but her eyes kept drifting to the door, like she was waiting for something to break the peace. Jace worked at the table, tinkering with an old radio he'd salvaged years ago. It was a habit. Keeping his hands busy kept his mind from wandering too far into the past. He glanced at the kids now and then, catching Milo's grin or Kina's quiet stare. They were growing on him, faster than he wanted to admit. Lyra, too, she didn't say much, but her strength showed in the way she held herself, even when she was exhausted. He still wasn't sure what he'd gotten into, agreeing to be their protector, but he hadn't walked away yet. The knock came late in the afternoon, sharp and heavy, rattling the metal door. Jace's hand froze mid-motion, the tool clattering to the table. Lyra shot to her feet, her face paling as she grabbed Milo and Kina, pulling them behind her. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice tight. Jace stood, his body shifting into a stance he hadn't used since his pilot days. Alert, ready. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't need to. The knock wasn't friendly. He opened the door, and there he stood, an alien taller than Jace, his green skin darker than Lyra's, his silver eyes cold and commanding. He wore a long, flowing robe marked with symbols Jace didn't recognize, and behind him stood three others, their hands resting on sleek, curved weapons. The leader's gaze flicked past Jace to Lyra, and a thin smile curled his lips. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, his voice smooth but edged with venom. Lyra's breath hitched, but she stepped forward, shielding the kids. "Vorn," she said, her tone hard. "You have no right to be here." Jace's eyes narrowed. Vorn, her mate, the one who'd abandoned her and the children. He didn't need to hear the story again, to know this guy was trouble. Vorn ignored her, his attention shifting to Jace. "And you, human, what's your part in this? Playing house with an exile?" His tone dripped with mockery, but Jace didn't bite. "They're with me now," he said, keeping his voice steady. "State your business and go." Vorn's smile widened, sharp and cruel. "My business is my blood. Those children belong to me. My people have reconsidered. They see value in them now, potential to strengthen our line. I'm taking them back." Milo whimpered, clutching Lyra's leg, and Kina's fists tightened, her eyes blazing with fear and anger. "We don't want to go," she shouted, her small voice cutting through the tension. Jace stepped forward, putting himself between Vorn and the family. "They said no. That's all I need to hear." Vorn's warriors shifted, hands tightening on their weapons, but Jace didn't flinch. He'd faced worse odds before. Pirates, storms, crashing ships. This was just another fight. Vorn laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You think you can stop me, human? You don't know our ways. They're mine by right." Lyra's voice broke through, sharp and fierce. "You lost that right when you called them impure and told me to leave them to die. You don't get to claim them now because your elders changed their minds." Vorn's eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he spread his hands like he was offering peace. "Things are different. We'll raise them properly, make them strong. They'll have a place with us." Jace tilted his head, catching the lie beneath the words. "Raise them, huh? Or break them into whatever your people want. I've seen that game before. Doesn't end well." The air grew thick, Vorn's warriors tensing as the standoff stretched on. Jace's mind raced. He had no weapons beyond his knife, no backup, just a rundown shelter and 3 people counting on him. Then an idea hit. He straightened, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "You might want to think twice. I've got this place rigged. Explosives in the walls. One wrong move, and we all go up." It was a bluff, pure and simple, but he sold it with every ounce of grit he had left. Vorn's smile faltered, his eyes flicking to the shelter's patched sides. He didn't know Jace, didn't know what a human drifter might be capable of. The warriors hesitated, glancing at their leader. "You're bluffing," Vorn said, but there was a crack in his confidence. Jace shrugged. "Try me." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Vorn stepped back, his silver eyes burning with rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, turning to his warriors. "We'll be back." They retreated into the desert, their shapes swallowed by the lengthening shadows. Jace didn't relax until they were gone, his shoulders tight with the weight of what had just happened. Lyra let out a shaky breath, kneeling to hug Milo and Kina. "You didn't have to do that," she said, looking up at Jace. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I did. I've lost people before. Couldn't save them. Not this time." Milo tugged at his coat, his voice small. "You're our protector now, right?" Jace hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kid, I am." Kina watched him, her fear giving way to something like trust. Lyra stood, her hand resting on Jace's arm for a brief moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the moons hummed low and the desert stayed quiet. For now. But Jace knew Vorn would return, and when he did, they'd need more than a bluff to survive. The night was heavy and still, the twin moons casting pale light over the desert. Inside Jace's shelter, the air buzzed with unspoken tension. Lyra sat on the cot, Milo curled up beside her, his soft snores breaking the silence. Kina perched near the window, her small frame rigid as she stared into the darkness. Jace worked at the table, his hands moving fast over scraps of metal and wire, building something, anything, to keep them safe. Vorn's threat hung over them like a storm waiting to break, and Jace knew words wouldn't stop him next time. Lyra glanced at him, her green eyes shadowed with worry. "He'll come back," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear beneath it. Jace nodded, not looking up from his work. "I know. And he won't be alone." He'd seen men like Vorn before, prideful, ruthless, the kind who didn't let go once they'd set their sights on something, or someone. Kina turned from the window, her fists clenched. Why does he want us now? He didn't before. Her tone was sharp, a mix of anger and confusion. Lyra reached for her, brushing a hand over her hair. Power, she said simply. He thinks you're worth something to his people now. He'll use you to prove he's strong. Kina pulled away, her jaw tight. I don't want to be his. You won't be, Jace said, his voice cutting through the room. He set down the tangle of wires, a makeshift trap, crude but effective, and met her gaze. Not while I'm here. Kina stared at him, then nodded, a flicker of trust in her eyes. Milo stirred, mumbling in his sleep, and Lyra pulled him closer, her face set with determination. The attack came just before dawn. A low rumble shook the shelter, followed by the screech of metal tearing apart. Jace bolted upright, grabbing his knife as the door buckled under a heavy blow. Get back, he shouted, shoving the table against the wall. Lyra yanked the kids behind the cot, her own hands trembling but ready to fight. The door burst open, and Vorn stormed in, his silver eyes glinting with triumph. 4 warriors followed, their weapons raised, sleek blades and energy pistols that hummed with danger. You should have run, human, Vorn sneered, stepping forward. Now you've got nowhere to go. Jace didn't answer. He kicked the trap he'd rigged, a mess of wires and a salvaged battery, sending a jolt of electricity arcing across the floor. One warrior yelped, dropping his pistol as the shock hit him. Vorn snarled, lunging forward, but Jace was faster, ducking low and slashing at his leg with the knife. The blade bit shallow, but it slowed him down. Lyra moved too, grabbing a metal rod from the table and swinging it at a warrior who got too close to the kids. The crack of it hitting his arm echoed in the small space. Stay away from them, she yelled, her voice fierce. Kina darted out, kicking the fallen pistol toward Jace. He scooped it up, firing a wild shot that forced the others back. It wasn't enough to win, but it bought time. The shelter groaned as another warrior smashed a wall panel, sand pouring in. We can't hold them here, Jace said, his mind racing. He grabbed Lyra's arm. The ship, my old crash site. It's not far. Her eyes widened, but she nodded. Kids, now, she called, pulling Milo up. Kina grabbed his hand, and they ran, Jace covering their escape with the pistol's last shots. They stumbled into the desert, the shelter collapsing behind them in a cloud of dust and sparks. Vorn's shouts faded as they sprinted toward a jagged shape on the horizon, a wrecked freighter half buried in the sand. Jace's ship, or what was left of it. He hadn't been back since the crash that ended his old life, but now it was their only chance. The hull loomed ahead, rusted and broken, but still solid enough to hide in. Jace pried open a hatch, ushering them inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of oil and decay. Consoles flickered faintly, their screens cracked but alive. Milo coughed, clinging to Lyra, while Kina stared at the cockpit. You flew this? She asked, awe creeping into her voice. Yeah, Jace said, sliding into the pilot's seat. Long time ago. Let's see if it still works. Vorn's warriors were closing in, their shadows moving through the sand. Jace's hands flew over the controls, rewiring what he could with tools from his belt. Lyra stood beside him, passing him parts as he called for them, her quick hands steadying his frantic pace. You're good at this, she said, a faint smile breaking through her fear. Had to be, he replied, flipping the switch. The engine sputtered, then roared. A weak, shaky sound, but alive. Outside, Vorn's voice boomed, closer now. You can't hide forever. Jace ignored him, focusing on the ship. It wasn't flight ready, not yet, but it could shield them. He rigged a panel to spark and smoke, making it look like the whole thing might blow. Get down, he told them, and they ducked as the warriors reached the hatch. The smoke billowed out, and Jace heard them curse and retreat, buying a moment's peace. Lyra crouched beside him, Milo and Kina pressed close. "Will they stop?" she asked, her voice low. Jace shook his head. "Not yet. But we're not done either." He looked at the controls, the old ship humming under his hands. It wasn't just a wreck anymore. It was a lifeline. Vorn's forces regrouped outside, their silhouettes growing sharper in the dawn light. Jace gripped the pistol, his jaw tight. Whatever came next, he'd fight for this strange little family he claimed. The wrecked ship trembled around them, its engines coughing and groaning like an old beast waking up. Jace hunched over the controls, sweat beading on his forehead as he patched wires and flipped switches. The cockpit was a mess of cracked screens and flickering lights, but it was alive, just barely. Outside, Vorn's warriors circled the hull, their shouts muffled by the thick metal walls. Lyra knelt beside Jace, holding Milo and Kina close, her green eyes fixed on him with a mix of hope and fear. The air smelled of burnt circuits and dust, but there was no turning back now. "Will it fly?" Lyra asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. Jace didn't look up, his hands moving fast. "It doesn't have to fly far. Just enough to get us out of here." He'd flown ships in worse shape, back when he had a crew, a purpose. Now it was just him and this little family he'd stumbled into, and he wasn't about to let them down. Milo peeked over Lyra's shoulder, his wide eyes bright with wonder. "Like a bird?" he asked. Jace managed a half smile. "Yeah, kid. Like a big, rusty bird." Kina stood near the hatch, clutching a metal rod she'd grabbed from the floor. "They're coming closer," she warned, her voice tight. Jace glanced at the cracked viewport. Shadows moved in the sand, Vorn's warriors spreading out to block their escape. He needed more time, but time was running out. Then an idea hit. He yanked open a panel under the console, pulling out a tangle of old comms gear. "Lyra, hand me that wire," he said, pointing. She passed it over, quick and sure, and he started rigging the system. "What's that for?" she asked, watching him work. "A trick," Jace said, his voice low. He patched the comms into the ship's power, boosting the signal. "They don't know what I've got in here. Let's make them think twice." He pressed a button, and static crackled through the speakers. Jace leaned in, pitching his voice deep and rough. "This is Outpost 7. We've got your position locked. Pull back, or we'll light you up." He cut the signal, letting it echo outside. Lyra's eyes widened. "There's no outpost." Jace grinned, a spark of his old pilot swagger coming back. "They don't know that." Through the viewport, he saw the warriors pause, heads turning as they muttered to each other. Vorn's voice barked something sharp, but the bluff worked. They backed off a few steps, unsure. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jace turned back to the engines, slamming a lever down. The ship shuddered hard, the floor vibrating under their feet. "Hold on," he shouted. Lyra grabbed the kids, bracing against a wall as the engines roared louder, spitting smoke and heat. The hull creaked, sand sliding off as the ship lifted, slowly at first, then faster. Vorn's warriors shouted, their shapes shrinking below as the freighter clawed its way into the sky. Milo cheered, his small fists pumping. "We're flying." Kina pressed her face to the viewport, her fear giving way to awe. "You did it," she said, looking at Jace like he'd just pulled the moons down for her. Lyra's hand found his shoulder, a quiet touch that said more than words. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. "Humans, you don't give up, do you?" Jace kept his eyes on the controls, guiding the ship higher. "Not when it matters," he replied. The desert stretched out below, a red blur fading into the distance. The ship wasn't built for long flights anymore. Too many parts were fried or missing, but it held together, carrying them away from Vorn and his threats. For now, they were free. Then the comms crackled again, unprompted. Vorn's voice cut through, cold and furious. "You think you've won, human. I'll find you. Those children are mine." The line went dead, but the words lingered, a dark promise. Jace's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the controls harder. "Not if I can help it," he muttered. Lyra sat back, pulling Milo into her lap. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Jace glanced at the star map flickering on a half-broken screen. "Somewhere new. A planet I heard about once. Green, quiet, far from here. We can start over." He didn't know if it was real, but it was a goal, something to aim for. Lyra nodded, a faint hope lighting her face. The ship rattled as it climbed through the atmosphere, the hull groaning under the strain. Milo tugged at Jace's sleeve, his voice sleepy but excited. "Are you our dad now?" Jace froze, the question catching him off guard. He looked at Milo, then Kina, who watched him with that same quiet intensity. Lyra didn't say anything, just waited, her breath held. "Yeah," Jace said finally, the words settling into him like a weight he didn't mind carrying. "Guess I am." Milo grinned, snuggling closer to Lyra, and Kina's lips twitched into a rare smile. "Good," she said simply. The ship broke through the clouds, stars spilling across the black sky ahead. Vorn was out there, hunting them, but for the first time in years, Jace felt alive. Flying again, fighting for something real. Lyra leaned closer, her voice barely above the engine's hum. "You're more than I hoped for," she said. Jace didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth lifted. The ship soared on, a battered relic carrying a new family toward an uncertain future. They'd escaped, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The ship groaned as it touched down, its engines wheezing out their last breaths before falling silent. Jace eased the controls back, peering through the cracked viewport at the world outside. Green stretched in every direction, rolling hills of soft grass, trees with wide, swaying leaves, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. This was the planet he'd aimed for, a quiet speck on an old map he'd half forgotten until now. It wasn't home, not yet, but it was far from the desert and Vorn's reach. For the first time in days, the air felt light with possibility. Lyra stepped beside him, Milo cradled in her arms, Kina at her side. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. Jace nodded, pushing the hatch open. "Yeah. Let's see what we've got." A warm breeze rushed in, carrying the scent of earth and flowers, so different from the dust they'd left behind. Milo wriggled free, tumbling onto the grass with a laugh. "It's soft," he shouted, rolling down a small hill. Kina followed, slower, but her eyes were bright, taking it all in. Jace climbed out, helping Lyra down. She stood there, barefoot on the ground, her green skin catching the sunlight. "It's beautiful," she said, almost to herself. "We never had anything like this." Jace watched her, then the kids, feeling a strange ache in his chest. He'd spent years drifting alone, but now he was here, with them, building something new. "Better get used to it," he said. "This is ours now." They spent the day exploring. The ship had landed near a shallow river, its water clear and cold. Jace hauled out what supplies he could salvage, tools, a few crates of dried food, a blanket, and started clearing a spot for a camp. Lyra joined him, her hands quick and sure as she wove branches into a rough shelter. "My people used to build like this," she said, showing him how to tie the knots tight, before everything fell apart. Jace listened, adding his own tricks, how to angle the roof so rain would slide off. Together, they'd made something solid, a start. Milo and Kina ran back, their arms full of strange, glowing fruit they'd found. "Can we eat these?" Milo asked, holding one up. Jace took it, sniffing it carefully. "Looks safe. Try a bite." Milo bit in, juice dripping down his chin, and grinned. "Sweet." Kina tasted hers too, nodding approval. Lyra smiled, a real one this time, not weighed down by fear. "They're happy," she said, her voice low. Jace met her gaze. "Good. They deserve it." Night fell, and they sat around a small fire Jace had built. the flames crackling under the stars. Lyra told stories, tales from her people about warriors who rode the wind and stars that sang. Her voice was steady, weaving pictures in the air, and the kids listened, wide-eyed. Jace shared his own, a human story about a pilot who outsmarted a fleet with nothing but a broken ship and a sharp mind. Milo clapped, bouncing in place. "That's you," he said. Jace chuckled. "Maybe once." Kina sat closer to him, her usual guarded look softening. "Will you teach us to be smart like that?" Jace raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Sure, kid. You've got to know how to think fast out here." He showed them a simple trick, how to tie a knot that looked loose but held strong. Kina practiced it, her small fingers fumbling at first, then getting it right. "See," Jace said. "You're already learning." The peace didn't last. Late that night, Jace woke to a distant hum, a sound he knew too well. He climbed a hill near the camp, squinting at the sky. A speck of light moved, too steady to be a star. A ship. Vorn hadn't given up. Jace's stomach tightened, but he wasn't surprised. Men like that didn't let go easy. He slid back down, finding Lyra awake by the fire, her eyes sharp. "You saw it too," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Jace replied, keeping his voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. "He's coming. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." Lyra's hands clenched, but she didn't flinch. "What do we do?" Jace looked at the ship, then the land around them. "We get ready. This place is ours now. I'm not letting him take it." She nodded, a quiet strength in her posture matching his own. The next day, Jace started training them. He showed Lyra how to set traps, sharp sticks hidden in the grass, tripwires made from salvaged wire. She caught on fast, adding her own twists, like using the glowing fruit to lure enemies in. Milo and Kina learned too, how to hide, how to signal with whistles Jace carved from reeds. "You're small," he told them. "Use that. Stay low, stay smart." Milo giggled, ducking behind a bush, while Kina practiced her whistle, her face serious. By evening, the camp felt different, stronger, like a real home. Lyra sat beside Jace as the kids played near the river, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "You're giving us a chance," she said. "More than I ever thought we'd get." Jace shrugged, but his voice was firm. "You're fighting for it too. That's what matters." The speck in the sky grew larger that night, a shadow against the stars. Jace stood with Lyra and the kids, watching it come. They weren't running this time. They'd built something here, and they'd defend it, together. The fire burned bright behind them, a small but fierce light in the darkness. The sky darkened as Vorn's ship descended, its sleek shape cutting through the blue like a blade. Jace stood on the hill above their camp, the wind tugging at his coat, his eyes fixed on the approaching threat. Below, Lyra tightened the last trap in the grass, her hand steady despite the tension in her face. Milo and Kina crouched near the river, clutching their whistles, ready to play their part. The green planet they'd claimed as home felt alive around them. Trees rustling, water flowing. But now it was a battlefield, and they were ready to fight for it. The ship landed hard, kicking up dirt and leaves, its hatch hissing open. Vorn stepped out, his dark green skin gleaming in the sunlight, his silver eyes burning with fury. Behind him came a dozen warriors, armed with energy rifles and curved blades, their armor glinting like scales. "You can't run anymore," Vorn called, his voice carrying over the wind. "Give me the children, and I might let you live, human." Jace stepped forward, his voice calm but hard. "They're not yours. Never were. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Vorn laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and raised a hand. His warriors spread out, moving toward the camp. Jace didn't flinch. He'd spent the last day rigging this place. Traps, tricks, anything to even the odds. He gave Lyra a quick nod, and she slipped into the trees, silent as a shadow. The first warrior tripped a wire, and a net of woven vines snapped up, yanking him off his feet. He cursed, thrashing as the glowing fruit tied to it burst, splattering sticky juice that drew buzzing insects from the bushes. Another stepped on a hidden patch, and sharp sticks jabbed through his boot, sending him howling. Vorn snarled, pointing at Jace. "Kill him." Jace dove behind a rock as energy bolts sizzled past, scorching the ground. He pulled the salvaged pistol from the ship, firing back, not to hit, but to keep them scattered. Lyra emerged from the trees, swinging a heavy branch into a warrior's legs, dropping him fast. She'd learned from Jace, hit hard, move quick. And it showed. "Stay away from my kids," she shouted, her voice fierce enough to make them hesitate. Milo's whistle pierced the air, high and sharp. Kina's followed, a signal they'd practiced. Jace grinned. Time for the big play. He sprinted toward the ship, drawing their fire, then ducked as the old freighter's engines roared to life. He'd rigged them to a timer, and now they sputtered and smoked, belching a thick cloud that rolled over the field. The warriors coughed, blinded, their shots going wild. Kina darted out, tossing handfuls of river pebbles into the chaos, small distractions that tripped and confused. Milo stayed low, crawling to a trap Jace had set, a pile of rocks tied to a rope. He yanked it, and the stones tumbled down the hill, crashing into two warriors with a satisfying crunch. "Got him," he yelled, ducking back into the grass. Vorn pushed through the smoke, his blade raised, aiming for Jace. "You think your tricks can stop me?" he roared. Jace met him head-on, dodging the swing and slamming his shoulder into Vorn's chest. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt. Vorn was stronger, but Jace was faster, twisting free and landing a solid punch to his jaw. "This is our home," Jace growled. "You don't get to take it." Lyra appeared, swinging her branch again, catching Vorn across the back. He staggered, snarling, but didn't fall. The kids ran to Jace, Milo clutching his leg, Kina holding her rod like a spear. "We're with you," she said, her voice steady. Vorn lunged, but Jace grabbed his arm, using his own momentum to throw him into a trap, a pit lined with thorns. Vorn crashed in, howling as the spikes bit deep. The remaining warriors froze, their leader down, the smoke still thick. Jace stood tall, pistol raised. "Go," he said, his voice cold. "Or you're next." They hesitated, then fled, dragging Vorn's cursing form back to their ship. The engines whined as it lifted off, wobbling into the sky, a beaten shadow against the setting sun. Silence fell, broken only by the river's soft rush. Jace dropped to one knee, breathing hard, as Lyra and the kids rushed to him. "You okay?" she asked, her hand on his shoulder. He nodded, managing a tired grin. "Yeah, we did it." Milo hugged him tight, Kina joining in, her rod clattering to the ground. "You're the best dad," Milo said, his voice muffled. Jace's throat tightened, but he didn't pull away. "You're not bad yourself, kid." That night, they sat by the fire, the camp battered but standing. Lyra wove a small bracelet from grass, slipping it onto Jace's wrist. "My people do this when someone becomes family," she said quietly. He looked at it, then at her, Milo and Kina, all watching him with trust he hadn't earned in years. "Guess I'm staying," he said, his voice soft but sure. The stars glittered above, endless and bright. Vorn was gone, his threat broken, and this green world was theirs. Jace leaned back, the weight of his old life lifting, replaced by something stronger, a family forged in fight and hope. They'd won, not just against Vorn, but for each other. And that, Jace thought, was worth everything.